The rifle trembled in her hands as rain hammered the porch, mixing with blood that pooled at her feet. Behind her, 2 children huddled in the doorway, their terrified eyes watching their mother aim an arrow at men who'd come to drag her away. In front of her, Marcus lay crumpled against the railing, clutching his side where crimson seeped through his fingers, his voice barely a rasp through the storm. "You asked if I wanted a wife or just shelter," he gasped, rain streaming down his face. "I finally know the answer." Lightning split the sky, illuminating 5 riders circling the property, their weapons gleaming wet and deadly. The leader's voice cut through the thunder. "Last chance, cowboy. Hand over the savage, or we burn it all." Sarah's fingers tightened on the bowstring, her husband's weapon now hers. She'd already lost 1 man to violence. She wouldn't lose another. Not this one. Not the man who'd taught her daughter to laugh again. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, you need to know where it began. Marcus Bennett was a man carved from silence and solitude, known across the Montana Territory as the rancher who needed nothing from anyone. At 34, he had everything the frontier could offer: 200 acres of prime grazing land, a sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, and a reputation that kept trouble at arm's length. His shoulders were broad from years of hard work, his eyes the color of storm clouds, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made even wild horses settle. But no woman had ever gotten close enough to see what lay beneath. The war had ended a decade ago, but Marcus still carried it in the set of his jaw and the way he slept with one hand near his gun. He'd learned that loving something meant losing it, and he'd lost enough. So he kept to himself on his ranch outside of Helena, mending fences, trading cattle, and building walls around his heart that were higher than any stockade. The town folks whispered about him over Sunday dinners and Saturday night card games. They'd seen him turn down the schoolteacher, a pretty widow, with kind eyes and soft hands. They'd watched the banker's daughter try her luck, offering home-cooked meals and sweet smiles. Even the preacher had attempted to set him up with his own niece, a girl fresh from Boston with dreams of taming the Wild West. Marcus had been polite but firm with them all. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not looking for company," he'd say, tipping his hat before riding back to his empty cabin. What they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't afraid of love. He was afraid of what came after, the silence that followed laughter, the cold side of the bed, the way grief could hollow a man out until he was nothing but a shell, walking through the motions. It was late August 1883 when everything changed. Marcus had been checking his northern fence line, the one that bordered the open territory where the Salish and Blackfeet still moved with the seasons. The afternoon sun sat heavy in gold on the horizon, and he was thinking about the coming winter, calculating how much hay he'd need to put by, when he saw it. Smoke. Not the lazy gray of cooking fires or the white of steam from a hot spring. This was thick and black, boiling up from behind the ridge like a wounded animal breathing its last. Something in his gut twisted. Marcus kicked his horse into a gallop, the gelding's hooves pounding across the dry earth, sending up clouds of dust that caught in his throat. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened. He could smell it now. Burning wood, singed cloth, and something else. Something that made his war memories claw their way to the surface. When he crested the ridge, his horse nearly reared. Below him, what had been a small settlement was now a graveyard of smoke and ash. 3 teepees still smoldered, their poles jutting up like broken bones. Personal belongings lay scattered across the ground. A child's doll, a cooking pot, a blanket torn and trampled. The earth was scorched and pocked with bullet holes, and in the center of it all stood a woman. She was maybe 30, her long black hair hanging loose around her shoulders, streaked with ash and soot. Her dress, a simple cotton thing that looked like it might have once been blue, was torn at the sleeve and stained with dirt. Her face was set in a mask of such fierce control that Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. In her arms, she held a little girl, no more than 5, who had her face buried against her mother's shoulder. Behind her stood a boy, perhaps 8, gripping a stick like it was a weapon, his eyes darting between his mother and the approaching stranger. Marcus dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. He'd learned during the war that sudden movements got people killed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and careful. "You hurt?" The woman's eyes, dark as river stones and just as hard, fixed on him. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she seemed to be measuring him, weighing whether he was threat or salvation. Finally, she spoke. "I need a shovel." Her voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the hairline fractures beneath it. He'd heard that voice before, in the field hospitals after battles, in the voices of men who'd seen their units wiped out but still had to keep moving. He pulled the shovel from his saddlebag and handed it to her without question. Then he grabbed his own and started digging. They worked in silence as the sun descended toward the mountains. The woman showed him where to dig. 6 graves in total. Her husband was among them, a man whose face Marcus glimpsed only briefly before the earth covered him. The woman never cried. She never spoke. She just worked, methodical and precise, as if burying her world was just another chore to be completed before nightfall. When the last grave was filled and the last stone placed, darkness had settled over the land like a blanket. The children sat huddled together near what remained of their home, and the woman stood looking at the graves, her back straight, her hands clenched at her sides. Marcus started to gather kindling for a fire. He didn't ask permission, he just did it, building a small ring of stones and coaxing flames from his tinderbox. He pulled jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag and set them near the fire without a word. The woman finally turned to look at him. In the firelight, he could see her face more clearly. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. "You ride alone," she said. It wasn't a question. That's easy when there's no one waiting. Marcus felt the words hit him like a fist to the sternum. He didn't respond. Instead, he fed another stick to the fire and settled back on his heels. The woman sat down across from him, pulling the children close. The little girl had finally stopped crying, and the boy had let go of his stick. They ate the food Marcus had offered, small bites taken carefully, as if they weren't sure it was real. "I'm Sarah," the woman said eventually. "Sarah Two Rivers, half Salish, half settler. My husband was John Rivers. He worked as a scout for the army until—" She paused, looking at the fresh graves. "Until he decided that being caught between two worlds was killing us slower than any bullet could." Marcus nodded. He knew about being caught between worlds. The war had left him suspended between the man he'd been and the man he'd become, never quite fitting in either skin. "This was his family's land," Sarah continued. "His mother's people. We thought if we stayed small, stayed quiet, kept to ourselves, they'd leave us alone." Her laugh was bitter. "We were wrong." "Who did this?" Marcus asked. "Raiders. White men wearing cavalry jackets they probably stole. They came at dawn, said we were squatting on government land, said we had to go. John tried to reason with them. He showed them the deed his mother had been given, showed them we weren't causing trouble." She paused, staring into the fire. "They shot him first. Then they shot anyone who tried to run." The children had fallen asleep against her, and Sarah carefully adjusted them so they lay on the ground, using what remains of a blanket to cover them. "You got anywhere to go?" Marcus asked quietly. Sarah shook her head. "John's people moved north 2 years ago. My father's people. They wouldn't take us. Said I chose white man's ways when I married John. Said I made my bed." Marcus stood and walked to his horse, checking the saddle straps he'd already checked twice. He knew he should ride away. He knew that taking on someone else's trouble was a fool's errand. He knew that the moment he offered help, he'd be opening a door he'd kept locked for 10 years. But when he turned back and saw Sarah sitting there, her back straight, despite the weight she carried, he heard himself say, "I got a place. About 8 miles west. Got room. You and the kids can stay there until you figure out what's next." Sarah looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face before she masked it. "Why would you do that?" "Because," Marcus said, settling back by the fire. "Someone needs to." The next morning, they loaded what little could be salvaged onto Marcus's horse and started the trek to his ranch. Sarah walked with the children, never complaining about the distance, never asking Marcus to slow down. The boy, whose name was Tommy, kept looking back at the burned settlement until it disappeared behind the hills. The little girl, Rose, held her mother's hand and didn't speak at all. When they finally reached Marcus's property, Sarah stopped at the edge and just stared. It wasn't much. A log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a corral that needed mending, and fields that stretched toward the mountains. But it was whole. It was standing. It was safe. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it," Marcus said, dismounting. "Barn was here when I bought the land. Rest I added as I went." He showed them inside. The cabin was sparse but clean. A main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom off to the side, a loft accessible by ladder. The furniture was rough but sturdy, built by hands that knew how to work wood but didn't care much about decoration. "You can have the bedroom," Marcus said. "I'll sleep in the loft." Sarah turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "We're not pushing you out of your own bed." "You're not pushing. I'm offering." They stared at each other for a long moment. Two people who'd learned that accepting help was harder than offering it. Finally, Sarah nodded. "1 week. We'll stay 1 week while I figure out what to do next. But we work for our keep. I'm not a charity case." "Didn't think you were," Marcus said, and so began the strangest arrangement Marcus had ever known. Sarah rose before dawn and had coffee ready by the time Marcus came down from the loft. She cooked meals that made his small kitchen smell like something other than loneliness. She mended the tears in his shirts that he'd been meaning to fix for months. She worked alongside him in the corral, showing Tommy how to gentle the horses, while Rose collected eggs from the chickens Marcus had forgotten to check. But she never smiled. She never laughed. She moved through the days with the same fierce control she'd shown at the graves, as if emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Marcus understood. He'd lived that way for years. 1 week turned into 2, then 3. The leaves started changing color, painting the mountains in gold and crimson. Marcus found himself listening for Sarah's footsteps in the morning, watching the way she braided Rose's hair before bed, noticing how Tommy had started following him around like a shadow. The children brought something to the ranch he hadn't known was missing. Rose's quiet giggles when he taught her to whistle. Tommy's questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how to track a deer, the way they both ran to greet him when he came back from checking the fences, as if his return was the most important thing in their day. But it was Sarah who occupied his thoughts in the quiet moments, the way she stood on the porch at sunset, looking toward the mountains as if she could see something he couldn't, the calluses on her hands from work, the flash of pain that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. He started riding into town less frequently, uncomfortable with the questions and stares, but supplies ran low, and eventually he had no choice. Helena on a Saturday afternoon was crowded with ranchers, miners, and merchants. Marcus tied his horse outside the general store and tried to move quickly, grabbing flour, sugar, coffee, and ammunition. He was almost done when he heard the voice. Well, well, if it isn't Marcus Bennett, the hermit himself. He turned to find Jake Crawford leaning against the counter, a smirk on his weathered face. Jake worked for one of the bigger ranches north of town, and he'd never liked Marcus, though Marcus had never cared enough to find out why. "Jake," Marcus said neutrally, turning back to his list. "Heard you got yourself some company out there," Jake continued. "Indian woman, and a couple half-breed kids. That true?" The store went quiet. Marcus could feel eyes turning toward them. "They're staying with me temporarily," Marcus said evenly. "Not that it's anyone's business," Jake laughed. "Temporarily? That what you call it? Man lives alone for 10 years. Suddenly he's playing house with a squaw. People talk, Bennett." Marcus's hands tightened on the sack of flour he was holding. "Let them talk." "You know what they're saying, don't you? They're saying she put some kind of Indian spell on you. They're saying you've gone soft in the head. Hell, some are even saying maybe you had something to do with that raid that killed her people, needed to ease your conscience." Marcus set the flour down carefully and turned to face Jake fully. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Say what you want about me, but if I hear you or anyone else speak about her or those children again, we're going to have a problem." Jake's smirk widened. "That a threat?" "It's a promise." For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. Then Jake made his mistake. He spat on the floor and said, "Whore's got you wrapped around her?" Marcus's fist caught him mid-sentence. Jake went down hard, blood spurting from his nose. He scrambled back up, swinging wildly, but Marcus had learned to fight in back alleys and battlefield trenches where there were no rules except survive. He ducked Jake's punch and landed another to his ribs, then a third that sent Jake stumbling into a display of canned goods. The sheriff arrived just as Marcus was picking up his scattered supplies. Sheriff Tom Morrison was an old man who'd seen too much violence to get excited about a simple fistfight. "That'll be enough, Marcus," he said tiredly. "Jake, get yourself to the dock. Marcus, get your things and get out of my town for a while." Marcus paid for his supplies and walked out, his knuckles bleeding, his heart pounding. He didn't look back. When he got home, it was full dark. Sarah was on the porch, the children already asleep inside. She looked at his bloody knuckles and said, "What happened?" "Nothing worth talking about." "Marcus." He sighed and sat down on the step beside her, suddenly exhausted. "Man in town said some things. I made sure he won't say them again." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to fight for me." "I didn't fight for you," Marcus replied. "I fought because they don't know the truth." "And what truth is that?" He turned to look at her, really look at her, and the words came out before he could stop them. "That you're stronger than all of us." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Then, for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. It was small and fleeting, like sun breaking through clouds, but it was real. They sat there in the darkness, not touching, not speaking, but something had shifted between them. Some wall had developed a crack. Autumn deepened. Marcus taught Tommy how to ride properly, how to rope a steer, how to read the weather in the movement of animals and the smell of the air. He showed Rose where the wild strawberries grew and how to skip stones on the creek that ran through his property. And Sarah. Sarah slowly began to thaw. He caught her humming while she kneaded bread. He saw her laugh when Rose told a silly joke. He watched her face soften when she looked at her children, the fierce control giving way to something warmer, but she still kept her distance from him, still made sure there was always space between them, always a boundary she wouldn't cross. One evening, Marcus found her outside by the fence line. She was watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and orange, and there was something in her posture that made him pause before approaching. "You turned down every woman who crossed your path," she said, without looking at him. "The banker's daughter, the school teacher, even the preacher's niece. The whole town talks about it. So why let me stay?" Marcus leaned against the fence beside her, careful to maintain that space she seemed to need. "Because you never asked to." She turned to him then, studying his face. "That doesn't make sense." "Doesn't it? All those other women, they wanted something from me, wanted to fix me, or save me, or tame me. They looked at me and saw a project, a possibility, something to be shaped into what they needed." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You looked at me and just saw a man with a shovel. You needed help, not a husband. That's the difference." "And now," Sarah asked, quietly, "what do you see when you look at me?" Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment. This was the cliff edge. He could step back to safety or jump. "I see someone who knows what it costs to keep going when everything in you wants to quit," he said. "I see someone who'd rather die fighting than live begging. I see," he stopped, swallowed. "I see the only person I've met in 10 years who understands why silence is sometimes kinder than words." Sarah's eyes were bright in the fading light. Marcus, but whatever she was going to say was interrupted by Rose running out from the cabin, calling for her mother to come see the rabbit Tommy had found. The moment passed, but it left something behind, a question hanging in the air between them, waiting to be answered. October arrived with cold winds and the promise of snow. Marcus had started laying in supplies for winter, making runs to town despite the tension it created. Sarah had taken over the garden, putting up vegetables and herbs in the small root cellar. The children had settled into routines, Tommy helping with the livestock, Rose learning to read from the few books Marcus owned. It felt, Marcus realized with both wonder and terror, like a family. And that's when the past came calling. It was a Thursday afternoon when Marcus saw the riders approaching from the east. 6 of them, moving with the kind of purpose that made his stomach drop. He recognized the leader even from a distance. Dale Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother and a self-appointed regulator who believed the frontier needed to be cleansed of what he called undesirable elements. Marcus called for Sarah and the children to get inside. Sarah took one look at the approaching riders and understood immediately. She herded Tommy and Rose into the cabin, but Marcus saw her pause to grab something from the chest where she kept her few belongings. When she emerged, she was holding a bow and a quiver of arrows. "Sarah, no, get inside and stay there." "Like hell," she said, her voice steady and cold. "This is about me. I know it. I'm not hiding. The riders pulled up at the edge of the property. Dale Morrison sat tall in his saddle, his face hard beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Marcus Bennett," he called out. "We need to talk." Marcus stepped off the porch, keeping himself between the riders and the cabin. "Then talk. We got word that you're harboring a fugitive, woman by the name of Sarah Two Rivers. She's wanted in connection with the raid on the Benson Ranch last month. 3 men killed, livestock stolen." "That's a lie," Marcus said flatly. "Sarah was here with me when that raid happened. She's been here for 2 months. You willing to swear to that in front of a judge?" "I'm willing to swear to it right now in front of God and anyone else who's asking." Dale's eyes shifted to Sarah, who had moved to stand beside Marcus, the bow held loosely in her hand. "The woman can speak for herself, can't she?" "I was here," Sarah said clearly. "I haven't left this ranch since Marcus brought me here after my settlement was burned. If there was a raid on the Benson place, someone else did it." "Convenient," Dale said. "Indian woman says she's innocent, and a lovesick rancher backs her up. You expect anyone to believe that?" "I expect you to leave my property," Marcus said. His hand had drifted toward his gun, not threatening, but ready. "Now." Dale leaned forward in his saddle. "Here's what's going to happen, Bennett. You're going to hand over the squaw and her half-breed whelps, and we're going to take them in for questioning. If she's innocent like you say, a judge will sort it out. If she's not," he shrugged. "Well, that's justice." "There is no justice in what you're proposing," Marcus said. "And she's not going anywhere." One of the other riders, a young man Marcus didn't recognize, spat tobacco juice on the ground. "You willing to die for her, cowboy?" Marcus felt something settle inside him, a calm certainty that reminded him of the war. "I already have." Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm clouds had been building all afternoon, and now the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Dale's hand moved toward his gun. "Last chance, Bennett. Step aside." And that's when everything exploded. And now we return to that rain-soaked moment, the one where everything hung in the balance. Marcus drew and fired in one smooth motion, his bullet taking Dale's horse in the flank, not killing it, but enough to send it rearing, throwing Dale from the saddle. Sarah's arrow found its mark in another rider's shoulder, and suddenly there was chaos. The storm broke fully, rain pouring down in sheets that turned the ground to mud. Guns roared. Marcus dove behind the water trough, returning fire while Sarah loosed arrow after arrow with deadly precision. She wasn't aiming to kill, he realized. She was aiming to disable, to wound, to make them retreat without turning this into a massacre. But the riders had numbers and determination. One of them made it to the porch, kicking in the door. Marcus heard Tommy scream and felt something crack inside him. He rushed the man, tackling him off the porch and into the mud, fists flying. Through the rain and chaos, he saw Dale back on his feet, gun raised, aiming at Sarah. Marcus threw himself toward her, feeling the bullet tear through his side, even as he crashed into her, sending them both sprawling. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and breathtaking, but he couldn't stop. He raised his gun and fired, the bullet catching Dale in the leg, dropping him again. Sarah was screaming his name, her hands pressing against his side, where blood was already soaking through his shirt, but he pushed her away, forcing himself to his feet. "The children!" he gasped. "Check the children!" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then ran toward the cabin. The remaining riders had scattered, dragging their wounded with them. Dale was crawling toward his horse, leaving a trail of blood in the mud. Marcus stumbled after him, his vision starting to gray at the edges. He grabbed Dale by the collar and hauled him up, their faces inches apart. "You come back here," Marcus said, his voice barely a rasp through the pain. "And I won't aim for your leg next time. You spread more lies about Sarah or those kids, and there won't be anywhere in this territory you can hide from me. We clear." Dale's face was white with pain and shock. He nodded. Marcus let him go and watched him crawl to his horse and drag himself into the saddle. The other riders were already retreating, leaving only the rain and the blood and the ringing silence of aftermath. Marcus tried to walk back to the cabin, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He went down on the porch steps, his hand pressed to his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood mixing with the rain. Sarah was there instantly, her children behind her, both scared, but alive. She knelt in front of him, pulling away his hand to assess the wound. "You fool," she whispered, and there were tears on her face mixing with the rain. "You absolute fool. You should have let me go." Marcus looked at her, at the way her hair hung in wet ropes around her face, at the fear and fury and something else in her eyes. He tried to smile, though it came out more like a grimace. "You asked me once," he said, his voice weak, "if I wanted a wife or just shelter. Marcus, don't—" "I finally know the answer," he continued, forcing the words out, even as darkness started creeping in at the edges of his vision. "I want both. If it's you." Sarah made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pressed her forehead against his, her tears hot on his cold skin. "Then you better not die on me, you stubborn bastard, because I finally figured out my answer too." The storm began to ease, the thunder moving off toward the mountains. Sarah barked orders at Tommy to get water boiling and clean cloth, sent Rose to fetch Marcus's whiskey from the cabinet. Then she half-carried, half-dragged Marcus inside, laying him on the table because it was stronger than the bed. The bullet had gone through clean, but he'd lost blood. Sarah worked with steady hands, cleaning the wound, packing it with cloth, binding it tight. Marcus drifted in and out, catching fragments, Rose's scared face watching from the doorway, Tommy holding the lantern steady, Sarah's voice calm and controlled, giving instructions. When he finally surfaced fully, it was dark outside, and he was in his bed. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his chest, as if checking that his heart still beat. "How long?" he rasped. 6 hours since you decided to play hero," she said. Her voice was sharp, but her hand was gentle when she brushed the hair back from his forehead. "You lost a lot of blood, another inch to the left, and—" She didn't finish. "The kids, scared but unharmed. Tommy's watching the door like a soldier. Rose won't leave your boots. I think she's afraid you'll disappear if she doesn't keep them safe." Marcus tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Sarah pushed him back down. "You need rest. Real rest. That means lying still." "Can't. Need to check the perimeter. Make sure they didn't—" "I checked. Twice. They're gone, Marcus. They're gone, and they're not coming back. Not after what you did." He looked at her, really looked at her. Her dress was stained with his blood and rain. Her face was exhausted, but her eyes were fierce and bright, and full of something that made his heart stumble in his chest. "What I said before," he started. "I know. I meant it. I know that too." She paused, and he saw her gathering her courage. "My husband, John, was a good man. He gave me safety and a home, and those 2 beautiful children. But he never saw me, not really. He saw what he wanted me to be, quiet, obedient, grateful. He never asked what I wanted or what I dreamed about. He never fought for me the way you just did." "Sarah, let me finish. When you came to that burned settlement, you saw me. You saw a woman who needed help, not someone to save or fix or change. You gave me space to grieve and work and figure myself out. You never expected gratitude or payment or anything else. You just let me be." She took a shaky breath. "And then you went and nearly died for me and my children. What am I supposed to do with that?" Marcus reached up slowly and took her hand. "You asked if I wanted a wife or just shelter. The truth is, I haven't wanted anything in so long that I forgot what wanting felt like. But then you showed up and reminded me that wanting isn't the same as weakness, that letting people in isn't the same as breaking. So, what do you want, Marcus Bennett?" "I want mornings that start with your coffee. I want to teach Tommy to be a man and Rose to be fearless. I want to watch you plant flowers on the graves of people who mattered. I want—" He paused, his throat tight. "I want to stop being afraid of being happy." Sarah's smile was watery and beautiful. "Then maybe it's time we both stop surviving and start living." She leaned down and kissed him, gentle as a promise, fierce as a vow. And for the first time in 10 years, Marcus Bennett felt the ice around his heart finally begin to thaw. Recovery was slow. Marcus's wound healed clean, but it left him weak for weeks. Sarah nursed him with the same fierce competence she brought to everything else, bullying him into eating soup and forcing him to rest even when he insisted he was fine. Tommy took over many of the ranch chores, his thin shoulders squaring under the responsibility. Marcus watched from the porch as the boy learned to be steady and reliable, and felt pride swell in his chest. Rose appointed herself Marcus's companion, sitting beside his bed and telling him elaborate stories about the chickens and their various personalities. She made him laugh, which hurt his wound, but healed something else. News traveled fast in the territory. Sheriff Morrison rode out 2 weeks after the confrontation, officially to get Marcus's statement, but really to make sure no one had died. He sat on Marcus's porch, accepted a cup of Sarah's coffee, and told them that Dale had left the territory, and the charges against Sarah had been quietly dropped for lack of evidence. You made powerful enemies, the sheriff warned, but you also reminded a lot of folks that maybe we're supposed to be better than the worst of us. Take that for what it's worth. When November came and the first snow fell, Marcus was strong enough to work again. He and Tommy rode out to check the herd, while Sarah and Rose prepared the cabin for winter. It was a clear, cold day, the kind where every breath turned to frost, and the mountains looked close enough to touch. "Marcus?" Tommy said as they rode. "Can I call you Pa?" Marcus's throat went tight. "That what you want? Ma says you're going to marry her. That makes you my pa, doesn't it?" "I suppose it does." "Good," Tommy said firmly. "I like having a pa again." They rode in comfortable silence after that, just a man and a boy checking their land under an endless sky. That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow pink and gold, Marcus pulled Sarah aside. He'd spent weeks working on something with his good hand, carving and shaping until his fingers ached. Now he held it out to her, a simple ring made of turquoise he'd traded for in town, set in a band of silver he'd hammered himself. "You once said you didn't need saving," he told her. "And you were right. You saved me instead. Saved me from thinking that being alone was the same as being strong. So I'm asking, will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I see you, that I value you, that I choose you every single day?" Sarah took the ring with trembling fingers. "You sure about this, cowboy? Sure you want to tie yourself to a woman with a complicated past and 2 children who aren't yours? Those children are mine the moment you say yes, and your past is only complicated to people who don't understand that survival is its own kind of grace." He paused. "So? You going to give me an answer, or do I have to stand out here in the snow all night?" She slipped the ring onto her finger and smiled. "Then maybe it's time we stop surviving and start living." They married in early December in the small church in Helena, with only the sheriff and his wife as witnesses. Tommy wore his first suit, too big in the shoulders but worn with pride. Rose scattered dried flower petals and declared herself the most important person there. Some of the townspeople whispered, some disapproved, but more came to the reception Sarah and Marcus held at the ranch, bringing food and well wishes and grudging respect for a couple who'd found each other in the ashes of loss. 5 years later, Marcus stood on his porch watching the sun rise over the mountains, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The ranch had grown. More land, more cattle, a bigger barn, but the best changes couldn't be measured in acres or gold. Tommy, now 13, was already in the corral working with the horses. He'd grown tall and strong, and he had Marcus's quiet way with animals. He talked about maybe becoming a veterinarian one day, and Marcus was saving money to send him to school. Rose, at 10, was fearless and brilliant. She'd learned to read and write from the new school teacher and was already helping younger children with their lessons. She wanted to be a teacher herself, she declared, and Sarah had smiled and said, "Then you will be." Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. Their child, Marcus's child, would be born in the spring. The thought still filled him with wonder and terror in equal measure. "You're thinking too loud," Sarah said, leaning against him. "Just remembering," he replied, wrapping an arm around her. "Remembering what it felt like before. The silence. The emptiness. You miss it?" "Not for a second." They stood there as the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and promise. Behind them, they could hear Rose singing while she fed the chickens and Tommy's voice talking gently to the horses. "You know what the funny thing is?" Sarah said quietly. "For years, I thought strength meant not needing anyone. Thought if I could just be independent enough, strong enough, I'd be safe. Then you came along and showed me that real strength is letting people in, is choosing to be vulnerable even when it's terrifying." Marcus kissed the top of her head. "You taught me that wanting things doesn't make you weak. That hoping for better doesn't mean you've forgotten the worst. That love isn't about replacing what you lost. It's about honoring it by choosing to live fully again." A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching slowly. Marcus tensed automatically, but Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's just Old Man Thompson," she said, "probably coming to complain about our fence line again." But Marcus kept watching until he could confirm it was indeed their neighbor, coming to argue about nothing important because he was lonely, and their porch was always welcoming. This was his life now. Not perfect, but real. Not free from trouble, but rich with meaning. Not without scars, but healed enough to hold new joy. Sarah had asked him once if he wanted a wife or just shelter. He'd learned the answer wasn't either or. He wanted partnership. He wanted family. He wanted someone to stand beside him through storms and sunshine. Someone to remind him that surviving was just the beginning. He wanted exactly what he had. A former widow with a complicated past and a fierce heart. 2 children who'd chosen him as much as he'd chosen them. And a future that stretched out like the prairie. Endless and full of possibility. The man who'd once turned down every woman in the territory had finally found the one who didn't ask for his heart. She'd simply reminded him he still had one. And that, Marcus thought, as Rose's laughter rang across the morning and Tommy called out a greeting to their approaching neighbor, was worth every risk he'd ever taken. The prairie wind carried their voices into the horizon, a testament to the truth that sometimes the hardest hearts are softened not by passion or pretty words, but by the quiet courage of someone who refuses to give up on tomorrow.